The courthouse corridor smelled like polished wood and broken promises. Officer James Morrison's boots echoed against the marble as Rex, his German Shepherd partner, padded silently beside him. 7 years together, they were a symphony of trust and understanding. But today felt different, ominous. Morrison stopped dead when he heard it, a child's desperate wailing piercing through the courtroom doors. His pulse quickened. Emma, age 3, sat crumpled against her grandmother in the waiting area, her entire tiny body convulsing with sobs. Her stuffed rabbit lay forgotten on the floor. Patricia, her grandmother, looked utterly helpless, whispering useless comfort as the child screamed. Morrison's jaw clenched. Federal court wasn't designed for toddlers. This little girl was drowning in a sea of adult darkness. Rex immediately sensed the distress. The dog's ears perked up, his protective instincts flaring, but Morrison held firm on the leash. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his own heart was breaking at the sight before him. In all his 23 years as a police officer, Morrison had seen countless traumas, crime scenes, accidents, violence. But witnessing a 3-year-old's complete emotional collapse was somehow worse. She was so small, so vulnerable, so utterly terrified that her entire body shook like a leaf in a hurricane. Patricia looked up as Morrison approached, her eyes red and desperate. She was in her mid-60s, gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, wearing a modest blue dress that spoke of someone who'd tried to look respectable for court. But nothing could mask the exhaustion etched into her features, the kind of exhaustion that came from a broken family and impossible choices. "She won't stop," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking. "I've tried everything. Singing, stories, promises of ice cream. Nothing works. She just keeps asking when we can go home, when she'll see her mother again." Patricia's hands trembled as she stroked Emma's hair, a futile gesture of comfort that the terrified child couldn't even process. Morrison crouched down slightly, trying to make himself less intimidating. Through the glass courtroom doors, he could see the judge already seated, checking his watch with visible impatience. The prosecutors were shuffling papers. The defendant, a man named Victor Carlson with cold, calculating eyes, sat at the defense table, looking utterly unconcerned about the chaos his actions had created. Emma's sobs intensified when she noticed Morrison in his uniform. To the child's frightened mind, he probably represented more authority, more scary adults, more of this horrible place. She buried her face deeper into Patricia's shoulder, her entire body rigid with panic. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, hyperventilation setting in, the telltale signs of a child completely overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her comprehension. "How long has she been like this?" Morrison asked Patricia, his voice gentle but professional. "Since we arrived an hour ago," Patricia replied, her own voice barely steady. The prosecutor explained what was going to happen, tried to prepare her, but Emma just broke. She kept saying, "Daddy did bad things, Daddy in trouble," over and over, like she couldn't understand how her father could do something that would bring her here, to this scary place with all these scary people. Morrison stood again, his eyes scanning the courthouse. Bailiffs moved with purpose. Journalists gathered in small clusters, eager for details on this federal drug trafficking case. Court officers stood at various stations. Everyone was moving forward with their jobs, their lives, their routines. But for Emma, time had stopped. The world had become a terrifying, incomprehensible place. Rex pressed gently against Morrison's leg, the dog's own anxiety reflecting his partner's distress. The shepherd had been trained in victim support, trauma response, and comfort work. Morrison could almost hear the dog thinking, "Why is the small human in pain? What can I do to help?" The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door, his expression stern and official. "We're ready for the witness," he announced, as if Emma were an adult prepared for this moment rather than a traumatized toddler on the verge of complete psychological breakdown. Morrison felt a surge of frustration. He'd worked hundreds of cases, collaborated with prosecutors, testified countless times, but never had he witnessed the system being so utterly ill-equipped to handle a situation. Emma wasn't a hostile witness. She wasn't refusing to cooperate out of spite or loyalty to the defendant. She was 3 years old, and her entire world had been shattered by circumstances beyond her control. Patricia stood up slowly, Emma clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The little girl's stuffed rabbit, a worn gray thing with one button eye missing, remained abandoned on the floor. Morrison picked it up instinctively and handed it to Patricia. Emma grabbed it desperately, pressing it against her chest, but the comfort object seemed almost mockingly insignificant against the enormity of her terror. As Patricia walked toward the courtroom doors, Emma's wails reached a crescendo. Her small fists pounded weakly against her grandmother's shoulder. "No, no, no, no," she cried, the word becoming a desperate mantra. "Don't make me go. Don't make me go. I don't like it there. It's scary. The big man is scary. Everyone is scary." Morrison watched them disappear into the courtroom, and something twisted in his chest. He'd signed up to protect people, to enforce justice. But in this moment, he couldn't help but wonder, at what cost? When does justice demand too much from the innocent? Rex whined softly, pressing harder against his leg. The dog sensed something that humans often missed, that sometimes the real trauma in a situation wasn't the crime itself, but the system's response to it. Through the glass doors, Morrison could see Emma being positioned in the witness chair, a chair far too large for her tiny frame. She looked like a doll, swallowed by furniture and formality. Patricia sat in the gallery behind the bar, her hands clasped so tightly they'd turned white. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, stood ready with her legal pad. The judge peered down from his elevated bench with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and impatient. And Emma simply sat there, trembling, her world reduced to terror and confusion, with no understanding of why she'd been brought to this cold, imposing place or what was expected of her. Her voice, when it finally came, would be barely audible, choked with fear, caught in the grip of a 3-year-old's complete and total psychological shutdown. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Morrison's shoulders. He'd brought Rex here to assist with evidence, to testify about the dog's detection work. Neither of them had anticipated this. Neither of them had expected that the real case would be won or lost based on a toddler's ability to overcome the most primal human fear. The fear of the unknown, the fear of adults in power, the fear of a world that suddenly seemed unsafe and incomprehensible. As Morrison and Rex stood in that corridor, watching through the glass doors at a system grinding forward with relentless momentum, neither of them could have predicted that the solution to this crisis wouldn't come from prosecutors or judges or defense attorneys. It would come from something far simpler, far more honest, and infinitely more powerful: the unconditional presence of a loyal dog and 2 innocent words from a terrified child. Sarah Chen stood outside the courtroom, her leather briefcase clutched against her chest like armor. She was a woman who'd built her career on calculated risks, strategic moves, and the unwavering belief that justice, real justice, required sacrifice. But standing in that courthouse corridor, watching Patricia desperately try to comfort her hyperventilating granddaughter, Chen felt the familiar weight of moral compromise pressing down on her shoulders with suffocating force. She'd been a prosecutor for 18 years. 18 years of interrogations, depositions, courtroom battles, and the endless parade of human depravity that came with the job. She'd put away murderers, rapists, drug lords. She'd sent people to prison for decades. She'd built a reputation as the most relentless prosecutor in Colorado. The woman you didn't want opposing you in court, because she would dismantle your case piece by piece, witness by witness, until nothing remained but the truth and your conviction. But Emma wasn't a witness in the traditional sense. Emma was a tool, a small, terrified, 3-year-old tool that fate and circumstance had placed directly in Chen's path at exactly the right moment to crack open the biggest case of her career. 3 years. That's how long she'd been investigating Victor Carlson and his drug distribution network. 3 years of surveillance, wiretaps, undercover operations, and countless hours of paperwork. The operation was sophisticated, professional, and devastatingly effective. Carlson had built an empire that stretched across 3 states, moving cocaine and methamphetamine through distribution channels that law enforcement had struggled to penetrate. The economic damage was incalculable. The human suffering, overdoses, destroyed families, shattered lives, was immeasurable. And then Emma had witnessed something. On a Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago, while her father, Carlson's nephew, was hosting what was supposed to be a family gathering, Emma had observed an exchange. Not the exchange itself, but the peripheral elements. Men arriving with urgency, packages being passed, her father's nervous behavior, raised voices, tension that even a 3-year-old could sense. The father, Marcus, had been arrested shortly after. He turned state's evidence, providing crucial details about the operation's mechanics, but his testimony alone wasn't enough. Carlson's lawyers would argue that Marcus was a disgruntled family member, motivated by his own legal troubles. The jury would need corroboration. They would need another witness, someone whose testimony would be corroborated by Marcus, someone whose presence at that crucial moment would cement the timeline and establish probable cause. They would need Emma. Chen had initially balked at the idea. She'd had conversations with Patricia, with child psychologists, with victim advocates. Everyone had warned her about the trauma, about the risks, about the ethical minefield of forcing a toddler to relive frightening experiences in open court. But Carlson had already posted bail. He was out there, potentially destroying evidence, potentially fleeing jurisdiction. The window of opportunity to prosecute was closing. And Emma was the key that could keep it open. Now, watching the child's complete psychological breakdown, Chen felt the first serious crack in her confidence. She approached Patricia slowly, deliberately, aware that her presence in her tailored suit and professional demeanor probably registered as another authority figure, another person demanding things the little girl couldn't give. "We need her testimony," Chen said, and immediately regretted the bluntness of her words. But there was no point in softening the reality. She's our only independent corroboration of the events at the house. Marcus can describe the exchange, but Carlson's defense will argue it was fabricated, manufactured to reduce his own legal exposure. Emma's testimony, what she observed, that's the piece that ties everything together. Patricia's face crumpled further. The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "She's 3 years old," Patricia whispered fiercely. "She doesn't understand any of this. She just knows she's scared and she wants her mother." Chen's jaw tightened. The mention of Emma's mother who'd abandoned the child with her father in a drug dealer's house, ignited a familiar fury in Chen's chest. This little girl was a victim of her own family's choices, circumstances she'd had no role in creating or controlling. And now Chen was asking her to be a tool in pursuit of justice. Was that justice, or was it something uglier? "The judge has already agreed to allow her testimony," Chen continued, her voice dropping lower. "Special accommodations have been made. The courtroom will be less crowded. She can have you nearby. We'll keep the questioning to essential points only." Patricia shook her head violently. "You don't understand. Emma has nightmares already. She wakes up screaming because of what she witnessed. She's been waking up at 3 in the morning, confused and terrified. And you want me to take her into that courtroom and make her relive all of it?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Chen had no good answer. She could cite statistics about the importance of victim testimony, about the criminal justice system's reliance on eyewitness accounts, about how justice required sacrifice. She could talk about the dozens of people Carlson's drug operation had harmed, the families destroyed, the lives lost to addiction. She could frame it as necessary, as the price of protecting society. But standing before a grandmother who'd sacrificed her own comfort and stability to care for a traumatized child, those arguments felt hollow. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison sat at the bench reviewing documents. He was a fair judge, relatively compassionate by judicial standards, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood that the criminal justice system couldn't function without witnesses willing to testify. He understood that sometimes witnesses, even young ones, had to endure discomfort in service of the larger goal. Chen entered the courtroom and approached the bench during a brief recess. "Your Honor, the witness is experiencing significant distress. I'm requesting a brief delay to allow time for her to stabilize." Judge Harrison glanced up from his documents. His expression was sympathetic but firm. "How much time are we discussing, Ms. Chen?" "Perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. I've consulted with a child psychologist who's available on standby. She believes a brief period of emotional regulation might help." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well, but we can't delay indefinitely. The defendant is entitled to a speedy trial, and we're already 2 days into proceedings. Tell the family they have 15 minutes. 15 minutes. As if 15 minutes could undo the trauma of a 3-year-old's life, could somehow prepare a toddler for the formal machinery of criminal justice, could transform pure terror into testifiable clarity. Chen returned to the hallway and found Patricia still trying to soothe Emma. The little girl's crying had become quieter, though no less desperate. Her eyes were swollen, her face blotchy, her breathing still irregular. She was pressing the stuffed rabbit so hard that cotton began to tear at the seams. "Sweetie," Chen tried, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "Do you remember when I came to visit you at home? Do you remember when I explained about the courtroom?" Emma didn't respond. She simply stared at Chen with eyes full of inexplicable sadness. Patricia placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "She remembers, but understanding and being ready are 2 different things." Chen stood again, her resolve wavering. She thought about her own daughter, now 12 years old, safely at home with a babysitter, untouched by the darkness that Chen encountered daily in her work. She thought about how she would react if someone asked her to bring that child into a federal courtroom, to expose her to trauma, to force her into a role she was developmentally incapable of handling. She thought about justice, and about the costs it sometimes demanded. 15 minutes, Chen said softly. "Try to help her calm down. We'll keep the questions simple and direct." As Chen walked away, she knew those 15 minutes would be insufficient. She knew that asking Emma to testify was asking too much of a child. She knew that sometimes the pursuit of justice required doing things that felt fundamentally wrong. But she also knew that Victor Carlson had poisoned communities, destroyed families, and profited from human suffering. She knew that without Emma's testimony, he might walk free. She knew that her job, her sacred obligation as a prosecutor, was to seek justice, even when that justice came with uncomfortable costs. The weight of that responsibility settled over her like a suffocating blanket as she watched Patricia desperately trying to prepare a 3-year-old for the impossible task that lay ahead. Marcus Webb had made a career out of being the enemy. That was his identity in the eyes of prosecutors, victims, and the general public. The man who defended the indefensible, who twisted logic and exploited technicalities, who stood between justice and accountability with an iron will and a sharp tongue. For 31 years, he'd been the voice of reasonable doubt, the architect of legal maneuvering, the man who could find a way to make the guilty walk free. He'd built a reputation that was both feared and despised. Defense attorneys rarely won popularity contests, but Webb had transcended simple professional antagonism. He was actively disliked by law enforcement, pitied by victims' advocates, and viewed by the general public as morally bankrupt. He'd received death threats. His office had been vandalized. His children had been ostracized at school because of his profession. And he'd accepted all of it as the price of doing his job. Justice in Webb's philosophy wasn't about truth or morality. Justice was about process. It was about ensuring that the system functioned fairly, that the accused received proper representation, that the prosecution proved its case beyond reasonable doubt. His role wasn't to establish innocence. It was to ensure that guilt was proven through proper legal channels, not through coercion, manipulation, or the exploitation of vulnerable witnesses. Victor Carlson was not an easy client. Webb had no illusions about his guilt. The evidence was substantial, the witnesses credible, the prosecution's case methodically constructed. Carlson was exactly the kind of defendant that made defense work feel morally compromised. A man who genuinely harmed people, who'd profited from addiction and suffering, who probably deserved everything the justice system could throw at him. But deserving wasn't Webb's concern. His concern was ensuring that Carlson received a fair trial, that his rights weren't violated, that the system worked as intended. Until he saw Emma. Webb had been reviewing documents at the defense table when the commotion in the hallway became audible even through the courtroom doors. A child screaming. Genuine, primal terror translated into sound. He'd glanced up from his papers, and through the glass partition, he'd witnessed something that struck him with unexpected force. A 3-year-old girl experiencing complete psychological breakdown. He'd seen many witnesses in his career. He'd cross-examined terrified victims, destroyed the credibility of reluctant witnesses, exploited the uncertainty inherent in human memory and perception. He'd been skilled at it, efficient at it, professionally accomplished at it. But watching Emma, watching a child so small that she was swallowed by her own terror, something shifted in the calculus of Marcus Webb's professional existence. During the recess, as Judge Harrison conferred with the prosecutors about next steps, Webb found himself standing at the doorway of the courtroom, observing the scene in the hallway. Patricia was still trying to comfort Emma, but the child had moved beyond comforting. She'd entered a state of pure panic, where logic couldn't reach her, where reassurance couldn't penetrate, where the adult world's attempts at soothing meant nothing against the magnitude of her fear. Webb's own daughter was 4. She looked remarkably similar to Emma, same dark hair, similar small frame, that vulnerable quality that defined early childhood. He thought about Emma's potential future trauma, about how testifying in federal court at age 3 might become one of those foundational memories that shaped psychological development. He thought about his daughter being placed in similar circumstances. And something cracked inside him. It wasn't a sudden moral awakening or a dramatic conversion. It was quieter than that. It was the recognition that some things transcended professional duty, that sometimes the system itself became unjust not through malice but through inflexibility, that occasionally the best defense wasn't legal maneuvering but simple human compassion. Webb made a decision that would have shocked his professional colleagues. He approached Judge Harrison privately, knowing that what he was about to suggest would undermine his own client's position, would potentially weaken the defense, would position him as less aggressive and ruthless than he'd built his reputation on being. "Your Honor," Webb began, his voice quiet and serious, "I need to speak with you about the witness." Judge Harrison looked up from his documents, his expression neutral. "Proceed." "The child," Webb continued, "she's not prepared for this. She's not capable of testifying in this condition. I've read extensively about trauma-informed witness procedures, about the psychological impact of forcing young children through formal testimony, particularly when they're already experiencing acute distress." The judge's eyebrow rose. "Mr. Webb, surely you're not suggesting we dismiss the child's testimony?" "No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting we temporarily suspend proceedings until the witness can be stabilized. I'm suggesting we find resources, psychological support, perhaps medication to help manage her anxiety, to prepare her adequately for testimony." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Webb with new interest. "That's an unusual position for a defense attorney. Typically, I'd expect you to use the witness's emotional state as grounds for exclusion." Webb nodded slowly. "Ordinarily, I would, but that's not what justice demands in this situation. Justice demands that we give this child the support she needs so that if she testifies with the capacity to do so. Otherwise, we're not pursuing justice, We're pursuing conviction at any cost, and we're sacrificing a child in the process." The judge was quiet for a long moment. "What are you proposing specifically?" "There's a police dog outside," Webb said, the words feeling slightly surreal even as he spoke them. "I've been reading about facility dogs in trauma situations. Studies show significant calming effects. The defendant won't be harmed by the dog's presence, but the witness might be substantially helped." Judge Harrison's expression shifted: surprise, then consideration. "A police dog in the courtroom." "Just within visual range," Webb clarified. "Close enough to provide emotional support but maintaining proper courtroom decorum. I'm prepared to stipulate that the dog's presence has no bearing on the defendant's rights or the integrity of the trial." The judge leaned back further, clearly conflicted. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Webb." "I understand, Your Honor, but the alternative is forcing a 3-year-old to testify while experiencing psychological breakdown. That serves no one, not justice, not the witness, not the integrity of this process." Webb was acutely aware of how this looked. A defense attorney arguing for resources to help the prosecution's witness. It violated every strategic principle he'd built his career on. It made him vulnerable, appeared weak, positioned him as less committed to defending his client. But as Webb stood there, waiting for the judge's response, he found he was okay with that. Judge Harrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the irregularity of the request against the very real human crisis unfolding outside the courtroom. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll allow it. Have the police officer position the dog near the witness stand. But Mr. Webb," the judge paused, "ensure that this doesn't become a distraction." "It won't, Your Honor." Webb returned to the defense table and caught Carlson's eye. His client looked confused by the unusual exchange. Webb didn't explain himself. How could he? How could he tell Victor Carlson that in pursuit of a defendant's rights, Webb had just done something that might actually strengthen the prosecution's case? But as Webb watched Patricia still desperately comforting Emma in the hallway, as he observed a 3-year-old girl trembling with fear, something in his moral calculus had shifted permanently. He'd spent 31 years believing that justice was about process, about ensuring the system functioned fairly. He was beginning to understand that sometimes justice required something more human than that. Sometimes justice required compassion. Officer James Morrison received the signal from the bailiff with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. The gesture was subtle, a small nod through the courtroom window, but it carried unmistakable meaning. "Bring the dog inside." Morrison's hand instinctively tightened on Rex's leash as he processed the unusual request. In his 23 years of law enforcement, he'd never been asked to bring a police dog into an active federal court proceeding. It violated protocol. It broke tradition. It was exactly the kind of unconventional move that made bureaucrats nervous and judges skeptical. Yet here it was, apparently sanctioned from the bench itself. "Come on, buddy," Morrison whispered to Rex, his voice carrying a gentleness that belied the magnitude of the moment. "I think we're about to do something important." Rex responded immediately to the command, his body language shifting from the casual alertness of the hallway to something more focused, more intentional. The German Shepherd had been trained extensively in victim support and trauma response. He'd worked with sexual assault survivors, domestic violence victims, and traumatized children in hospital settings. But courtrooms were different. Courtrooms were formal, rigid spaces where animals, even highly trained animals, were viewed with suspicion. Morrison took a breath and pushed through the courtroom doors. The effect was immediate and palpable. Every head in the gallery turned. The judge looked up from his bench. The prosecution and defense attorneys paused mid-conversation. Even the court stenographer glanced away from her machine. All eyes tracked Morrison and Rex as they moved through the courtroom with deliberate, measured steps. Emma's wailing, which had subsided slightly during the recess, stopped entirely. The little girl's eyes widened as she watched the large German shepherd moving through the formal space. Her entire body went rigid, and Morrison's heart sank momentarily. What if she reacted with more fear? What if the dog's presence made everything worse? But something else happened instead. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, seemed to deepen. Her eyes, which had been unfocused and panicked, locked onto Rex with an intensity that suggested the dog was somehow anchoring her awareness back to the present moment. Patricia felt the shift immediately, the slight relaxation of her granddaughter's rigid posture, the barely perceptible decrease in tension. Morrison positioned Rex carefully near the witness stand, mindful of courtroom decorum and the judge's expectations. The dog's placement was strategic, close enough that Emma could see him clearly, close enough that the comfort of his presence could reach her, but far enough removed that he wouldn't be perceived as intimidating or distracting. Morrison executed the positioning with the precision of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. Then Rex did something remarkable. The German shepherd, who'd been trained to maintain alert posture in working situations, deliberately lowered himself into a position of complete and utter gentleness. It was as if the dog somehow understood that this small human needed reassurance rather than protection, comfort rather than guardianship. Rex's ears, usually positioned for maximum awareness, naturally angled in a way that made him look eternally patient and understanding. His tail, instead of the high, alert position typical of working dogs, settled into a relaxed curve. His entire body language shifted from police dog on duty to friend offering silent support. Emma's eyes followed Rex's every movement with desperate intensity. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse, the little girl was experiencing something that made sense to her, something warm, something alive, something that didn't wear a suit or speak in legal terminology or demand things beyond her comprehension. Here was a creature that existed in the present moment, unconcerned with prosecution or defense or the machinery of justice. Patricia noticed the change immediately. She whispered to Emma softly, "Look, sweetheart, that's a nice dog, a very nice dog." Emma's lips trembled, but her eyes didn't leave Rex. The dog's mere presence seemed to have created a pocket of safety in an otherwise terrifying environment. Morrison could see the psychological shift happening in real time. The child's nervous system beginning to regulate, her fight-or-flight response giving way to something more stable, more manageable. Judge Harrison observed the interaction with evident interest. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the dynamic between the traumatized child and the calm dog. Morrison could almost see the judicial mind calculating. Did this violate courtroom decorum? Yes. Was it unusual and potentially precedent-setting? Absolutely. But was it accomplishing something valuable, helping a vulnerable witness access the emotional stability necessary for testimony? Undeniably. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, felt a surge of cautious optimism. She'd been prepared to lose this case if Emma couldn't testify. She'd been steeling herself for the possibility that one traumatized 3-year-old might derail an 18-month investigation. But watching the child's response to Rex, she could feel the momentum shifting. Not dramatically, not certainly, but perceptibly. The dog had created what psychology would call a secure base, a point of emotional reference that allowed Emma's nervous system to begin functioning again. Marcus Webb, the defense attorney, watched the same interaction and felt something unexpected, a sense of validation. His unconventional suggestion had worked. More importantly, it had worked in a way that served justice rather than undermining it. If Emma could testify, if she could access her memories and communicate them clearly, then the trial could proceed with integrity. The truth could emerge from a witness who was capable of articulating it, rather than from a child experiencing acute psychological breakdown. But Rex's role transcended mere courtroom utility. What the dog was accomplishing was something more profound than strategic advantage. Rex was bridging the impossible gap between Emma's internal world, a landscape of terror and confusion, and the external reality of the courtroom. The dog wasn't offering escape from that reality, but rather a way to navigate it. Rex wasn't dismissing Emma's fear, but rather standing alongside it, suggesting through his calm presence that fear didn't have to be paralyzing. Morrison remained standing near Rex, one hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. The physical contact served multiple purposes. It kept Rex grounded in his working role. It demonstrated that the dog was under control and not a courtroom novelty. And it provided Morrison with a focal point that helped him manage his own emotional response to the situation. Because what Morrison was witnessing transcended professional duty. He was watching a 3-year-old girl begin to access courage she didn't know she possessed. He was watching a dog employ his training in a moment where it mattered profoundly. He was watching the machinery of justice pause for a moment of profound humanity. Emma's breathing continued to stabilize. Her rigid posture softened incrementally. Patricia felt her granddaughter's grip on the stuffed rabbit loosen slightly. The little girl's eyes, while still frightened, had shifted from the unfocused panic of complete overwhelm to the focused awareness of someone beginning to engage with her environment. Judge Harrison nodded slightly at Morrison, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Morrison returned the nod with equal subtlety. No words were necessary. What had transpired in those few minutes existed beyond language, in a space where a traumatized child, a trained dog, and a system designed for justice had aligned in a moment of unexpected grace. The courtroom settled into a new equilibrium. The formal machinery of law and order continued its relentless progression, but now there was something else present in the room. There was hope. There was the possibility that a 3-year-old girl might find her voice not through coercion or demand, but through the simple, profound presence of an animal that asked nothing of her except to exist alongside her fear. Rex lay perfectly still, his breathing synchronized with Emma's, his presence a silent testament to the power of unconditional acceptance in a world that demanded everything but offered compassion. Sarah Chen stood at the prosecutor's table, her hands trembling slightly as she organized her notes. She'd prepared for this moment countless times during sleepless nights, envisioning how she would guide Emma through testimony, what questions would be essential, how to extract coherent information from a traumatized toddler. But all of that preparation now felt inadequate against the reality of what she was witnessing. Emma sat in the witness chair, a piece of furniture designed for adults, oversized and imposing from a 3-year-old's perspective. Yet something fundamental had changed in the past few minutes. The child's eyes, which had been wild and unfocused, now tracked steadily toward Rex. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, had deepened into something approaching normal rhythm. The trembling that had consumed her entire body had quieted to occasional shudders. But more than the physical changes, there was a psychological shift. Emma's consciousness seemed to have reoriented itself. Instead of being entirely consumed by fear, the child had found an anchor, something warm and present that existed in the same space as her terror but didn't amplify it. Chen had studied child psychology extensively for cases like this. She understood the concept of co-regulation, the process by which one person's calm nervous system helps regulate another person's dysregulated nervous system. A child in acute panic needed someone, or in this case, something, that demonstrated safety and presence. Rex was providing that demonstration not through words or forced reassurance, but through his fundamental being. A warm body, a steady presence, eyes that held no judgment. Judge Harrison glanced at Chen with a subtle nod. It was time. The recess had ended. The proceeding needed to move forward. Chen stood slowly, consciously arranging her features into an expression of gentle warmth. She was aware that her authoritative prosecutor persona, the sharp, incisive professional who'd built her reputation on aggressive questioning, would be counterproductive with Emma. She needed to transform herself into something different, a guide rather than an interrogator, a facilitator rather than a force. "Emma," Chen began, her voice deliberately soft and slow, modulating to a register that wouldn't startle or overwhelm. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" The little girl's eyes flickered toward Chen, but her gaze quickly returned to Rex. That was acceptable. Chen didn't need Emma's visual focus. She needed her cognitive focus, her ability to access memories and communicate them. "Emma, I know this is a scary place," Chen continued, maintaining her gentle tone. "I know there are a lot of people here and a lot of big furniture and probably a lot of confusing things, but you did such a brave thing coming here today. Do you know that?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. She was listening, even if she wasn't speaking. "I have some questions I'd like to ask you," Chen said. "Easy questions about the day at your daddy's house. The day when those men came over. Do you remember that day, Emma?" Silence. Long, stretching silence that made Chen's heart race. This was the critical moment, the point where Emma would either begin to access her memories or retreat further into paralysis. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper but crystalline in the profound quiet of the courtroom, Emma spoke two words that stopped time itself. "Good dog." The courtroom erupted internally. Not with sound, everyone remained formally silent, but with visible emotion. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. The judge leaned back, his stern expression softening with visible emotion. The court stenographer's fingers paused momentarily over her machine. Even Carlson, sitting at the defense table with calculated indifference, blinked with surprise. Emma wasn't answering Chen's question. She was making a declaration, a 3-year-old's pure, unfiltered assessment of the only thing in this terrifying space that made sense to her. She was saying, "This is good. This creature is good. Everything else is scary, but this is good." Sarah Chen felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. In all her years as a prosecutor, in all her carefully constructed courtroom strategies and calculated legal maneuvers, she had never experienced a moment quite like this. A child's simple statement had somehow reframed the entire proceeding. Emma wasn't testifying because she was compelled to. She was speaking because she'd found safety. She was beginning to access her voice not through legal obligation but through emotional connection. Officer Morrison's throat tightened as he watched the interaction. Rex, displaying the remarkable intuition that made him exceptional in his work, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. The dog's entire body settled deeper into the floor, his presence becoming even more grounded, more stable, more present. Chen took a breath, recalibrating her approach based on this breakthrough. She understood now that Emma wasn't refusing to testify. She was accessing courage through connection. The prosecutor's role shifted in that moment from interrogation to facilitation. Her job was to ask questions in a way that kept Emma anchored to Rex's calming presence while gently guiding the child toward the memories Chen needed to access. "That's a very good dog," Chen said softly, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "His name is Rex and he's a police dog. Did you know that?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but her eyes shifted slightly toward Chen, a small sign of engagement, of consciousness beginning to expand beyond pure fear. "Emma, can you tell me about the day those men came to your daddy's house?" Chen asked, her words carefully chosen to be simple, non-threatening, specific enough to guide Emma's memory without overwhelming her cognitive capacity. "Do you remember when they came?" Another long pause. Emma's small fingers gripped the arms of the witness chair. Her eyes flickered between Chen and Rex repeatedly, checking in with the dog, drawing strength, then trying to access the difficult memories being requested of her. When Emma finally spoke, her words came in fragments. "Men came back door, Daddy, scared." Chen's heart leaped. This was it, the testimony she needed, emerging from a child who'd found emotional stability through an unexpected source. The prosecution's case, which had seemed to hinge on an impossible request from a traumatized toddler, was suddenly viable. "That's very good, Emma. You're doing so well," Chen said, genuinely meaning every word. "What did you see when the men came? Can you tell me?" Emma's eyes remained fixed on Rex as she spoke, her young voice trembling but coherent. Bags, they had bags, big bags. Daddy took them, he looked. Scared, really scared. Marcus Webb listened to Emma's testimony and felt the weight of his earlier decision settling heavily upon him. He'd recommended the dog's presence, believing it was the right thing to do, but now he was experiencing the consequences. A witness who was becoming increasingly articulate, increasingly capable of providing the specific details that would damage his client's case. But watching Emma access her courage, watching her find her voice through connection rather than coercion, Webb couldn't regret his choice. Justice wasn't being served through the exploitation of a traumatized child. Justice was being served through the emergence of truth from a witness who'd found the emotional stability necessary to articulate it. Judge Harrison observed the proceedings with evident approval. He'd made an unconventional ruling, and it was proving to be the right one. A 3-year-old girl was testifying clearly, coherently, and credibly, not because she was forced, but because she'd found what she needed to access her own courage. Emma continued speaking, her words flowing more freely as her nervous system continued to regulate. She described the men's arrival, their urgent conversations, her father's anxiety, the packages being exchanged. She spoke about sounds, raised voices, tension, fear in her father's face. She articulated observations that only a child present in that moment could have made. And throughout her testimony, Emma's eyes kept returning to Rex, seeking confirmation, drawing strength, reminding herself that safety existed in this space, that she wasn't alone in her fear. Chen asked carefully chosen follow-up questions, each one designed to clarify without overwhelming, to extract detail without demanding more than Emma's developing mind could provide. And the little girl, anchored by the presence of a calm dog and guided by a prosecutor who'd learned to prioritize humanity over conviction, accessed memories she didn't know she could articulate. The breakthrough moment had arrived, not as a sudden event but as a gradual unfolding. A 3-year-old girl, terrified and traumatized, was finding her voice, not because the system demanded it, but because she discovered that speaking her truth was possible when you weren't drowning in fear. 2 innocent words, "good dog," had done what hours of preparation couldn't. They'd unlocked a child's capacity to access courage. Emma sat taller in the oversized witness chair. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Her body was still small, still dwarfed by furniture designed for adults, still visibly trembling with residual fear. But something fundamental had shifted in her bearing, in her presence, in the way she carried herself. She'd found an anchor, and that anchor had given her access to something deeper than fear, the capacity to speak truth. Sarah Chen felt the momentum building. She'd prosecuted hundreds of cases, had guided countless witnesses through testimony, but she'd rarely experienced this particular quality of emergence. A witness moving from complete psychological breakdown to functional coherence not through force or demand, but through the discovery of emotional safety. "Emma," Chen said, her voice maintaining the gentle register that had proven so effective, "you're doing something very brave right now. Do you know that?" Emma's eyes flickered toward Chen, then immediately returned to Rex. The dog remained in perfect stillness, his presence a constant beacon of stability that the child kept seeking and finding. "I want to ask you more about what happened," Chen continued. "About the bags the men had. Can you describe them for me?" Emma's small fingers gripped the witness chair's arms. Her breathing, which had stabilized to something approaching normal, quickened slightly at the question. This was deeper territory. She was being asked to provide specific details, to move beyond general observations into precise description. But Rex's steady presence held. The dog's calm remained unshaken, and Emma seemed to draw strength from that constancy. "The bags were black," Emma said slowly, her words coming with deliberate effort as she accessed memories that had been locked away behind terror. "Plastic, like the grocery bags, but thicker, and they were so heavy. The men, They held them tight, like they were scared someone would take them. Chen's heart raced. This was exactly the kind of detail that prosecutors dreamed of. Specific, credible, the observation of a child who'd absorbed details through proximity rather than intention. A 3-year-old wouldn't know to invent such specifics. She was describing what she'd observed. "That's excellent, Emma," Chen said, and meant it with profound sincerity. "You have a really good memory. Now can you tell me about your daddy? What did he look like when those men came?" Emma's eyes darted toward Rex again. That constant checking in, that need for reassurance that safety still existed in this space. The dog's ears twitched slightly, acknowledging the child's gaze without moving, without breaking the stillness that had become so protective. "Daddy was," Emma paused, her 3-year-old mind searching for the emotional vocabulary to describe what she'd witnessed. "Scared. His face got all tight, like when I get scared. His hands were shaking, and his voice, it got different, quieter, like he didn't want anyone to know he was scared, but he was really scared." Marcus Webb listened to Emma's testimony and felt the walls of his defense strategy crumbling with each coherent sentence. The child was articulating observations that corroborated Marcus's testimony about Carlson's involvement. She was describing her father's anxiety in ways that suggested he was operating under duress or coercion rather than voluntary participation. She was, through her innocent observations, constructing a narrative that devastated his client's position. But Webb found he couldn't muster the professional aggression to cross-examine this child aggressively. He'd made a choice earlier, a choice that had felt morally necessary. Now he was living with the consequences of that choice, and despite understanding how it would damage his case, he maintained his conviction that it had been the right decision. Judge Harrison studied Emma with evident fascination. He'd presided over thousands of cases, had heard testimony from expert witnesses and career criminals, had listened to elaborate legal arguments and complex depositions. But he'd rarely witnessed something quite like this. A 3-year-old girl, through her clear-eyed observations and simple descriptions, articulating a narrative that seemed to accurately reflect complex criminal activity. Chen continued her questioning and Emma continued her testimony. She described the men's conversations, how they'd mentioned the new supply and the distribution points. She described how her father had seemed reluctant, uncomfortable, pressured. She described the exchange of bags with specificity that only someone present could provide. "How many men were there, Emma?" Chen asked gently. Emma's eyes closed briefly as she visualized the memory. 2, maybe 3. It was confusing. They moved fast. Everything was fast and scary, but I remember at least 2 talking to Daddy, and maybe another one by the door. "Did you recognize any of those men?" Emma's eyes opened and immediately sought Rex again. The dog remained perfectly still, his presence steady and protective. After a moment of silent consultation with the dog, Emma spoke. "I knew one. The man with the scar. He came before. I didn't like him. He was mean to Daddy." Chen's entire body went still. An identifying feature, a prior interaction, a child's observation that placed Carlson, who bore a distinctive scar across his left cheek, at the scene with hostile intent toward the defendant's own family member. "Can you describe this man with the scar?" Chen asked, her voice maintaining perfect gentleness even as her mind raced with the significance of Emma's statement. "He was big," Emma said. "Bigger than Daddy. He had a scar like this." Emma gestured across her own face. "Right here. And he was angry. I could tell he was angry even though his voice was quiet." Through the courtroom, people were absorbing this testimony with visible reaction. The journalists in the gallery were scribbling furiously. The judge leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Even Carlson, who'd maintained stoic indifference throughout the trial, seemed to shift slightly in his chair. Sarah Chen had conducted thousands of witness examinations, but she'd rarely experienced this particular sensation. The feeling of a case crystallizing, of disparate elements aligning, of truth emerging with such clarity that contradiction seemed impossible. A 3-year-old girl, speaking in simple terms about observations she'd made, was constructing an evidentiary case that would be extraordinarily difficult for the defense to challenge. Emma's confidence continued to grow as her testimony progressed. Her words became less hesitant, her descriptions more detailed. Her ability to access and articulate memories strengthened with each successfully answered question. It was as though speaking one truth had opened a pathway to speaking others, as though the fear that had initially paralyzed her was being gradually replaced by the empowering realization that her voice mattered. "You're doing something incredibly important," Chen said softly during a pause in questioning. "Do you know that? Your words are helping make sure that people who do bad things can't hurt other people." Emma didn't fully comprehend the legal significance of her testimony, but she understood that she was being heard. She understood that her observations mattered. She understood that she was capable of surviving this terrifying space while telling the truth. Marcus Webb stood to begin cross-examination, and the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. The defense attorney approached the witness stand slowly, deliberately, giving Emma time to notice him, to assess him, to determine if he was a threat. "Hello, Emma," Webb said gently, his voice carrying none of the aggressive edge typical of cross-examination. "My name is Mr. Webb. I'm going to ask you some questions, okay?" Emma's eyes sought Rex immediately. The dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement, his presence unwavering. "Did all of those things you described actually happen?" Webb asked, his question carefully constructed to be open-ended rather than leading or hostile. "Yes," Emma said simply. "They really happened, I remember." Webb paused, studying the child with evident compassion. He could have pushed harder, could have attempted to create confusion or contradiction in her testimony. Instead, he asked clarifying questions designed to test her consistency rather than destroy her credibility. Because Marcus Webb had learned something fundamental during this proceeding, that justice wasn't about winning. Justice was about truth. And the truth, as articulated by a 3-year-old girl who'd found the courage to speak it, was undeniable. Emma's testimony continued through the afternoon. Her words remained consistent. Her descriptions remained specific. Her observations remained credible. With each answer, the case against Victor Carlson solidified further. And throughout it all, Rex remained in perfect stillness, a silent guardian, a steady presence, an anchor that allowed a terrified child to access the extraordinary courage it took to tell the truth. The jury deliberation room was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional scrape of a chair. 12 ordinary citizens, a retired teacher, a construction worker, a nurse, a software engineer, a small business owner, and 7 others representing the demographic cross-section of Denver, sat around a table laden with evidence photographs, transcript excerpts, and legal instructions from the judge. They'd been deliberating for 5 hours and 43 minutes. The foreman, a woman named Patricia Donnelly, no relation to Emma's grandmother, stood at the whiteboard and wrote out the charges one final time. Count 1, drug trafficking. Count 2, drug trafficking. Count 3, money laundering. Count 4, money laundering. Count 5, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. 5 counts. Any one of them could result in significant prison time. "I think we need to take a vote," Patricia said, her voice measured and tired. "We've reviewed the evidence. We've discussed the testimony. We've analyzed the defendant's defense strategy. I think we all know where this stands." A juror in the back, a retired accountant named David, raised his hand slightly. "I just want to confirm one more time. That little girl, her testimony was credible, right? We all agreed on that." The jury nodded collectively. There had been intense discussion about whether a 3-year-old's testimony could be reliable, whether a young child could accurately observe and remember complex criminal activity. But Emma's specificity, her consistency under cross-examination, her description of identifying details like Carlson's distinctive scar, all of it had aligned perfectly with the physical evidence and the testimony of other witnesses. She was credible, Patricia Donnelly confirmed. And honestly, I don't think any of us will forget what we witnessed. Watching that child overcome her terror to tell the truth, that's not something you see every day. A juror named Michael, a father of two, wiped his eyes. That dog. I know it sounds weird, but I genuinely believe that dog gave that little girl the strength to testify. Without it, I don't think she would have been able to speak at all. Whether it was the dog or something else, Patricia said, the fact is, she testified, she was clear, she was credible, and her testimony combined with the digital evidence, the surveillance footage, and Marcus's testimony creates an overwhelming case against the defendant. The vote was taken by secret ballot, 5 counts, 5 guilty verdicts, one after another. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of decision. Sarah Chen sat rigidly at the prosecution table, her hands folded before her, her expression carefully neutral. But her heart was racing. This was it, the culmination of 18 months of investigation, dozens of interviews, hundreds of hours of preparation. Victor Carlson sat at the defense table, his face a mask of calculated indifference. But everyone in the courtroom could sense the shift in energy. Even before the verdicts were read, everyone seemed to understand the outcome. Judge Harrison called for the jury to be brought in. The jury filed back into the courtroom, and Emma watched from the gallery where she sat with Patricia. The little girl had returned for the verdict, not because she was required to, but because her grandmother wanted her to understand, in whatever way a 3-year-old could understand, that her bravery had resulted in something meaningful. The clerk stood with the verdict forms, her voice formal and official. On the count of drug trafficking in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, the foreperson announced. Guilty for the second count. Guilty for the third count. With each guilty verdict, Sarah Chen felt a profound sense of validation. Not because she'd won, though she had, but because the system had worked. A traumatized child had found her voice. The truth had emerged. Justice had been served. Marcus Webb listened to the verdicts with the complicated emotions that came with being on the losing side of a case you'd fought with everything you had. But underneath the professional disappointment, there was something else. The satisfaction that came from ensuring the process had been just, that a vulnerable witness had been protected even as her testimony had helped convict your client. Victor Carlson's expression finally cracked. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the table. For the first time during the entire trial, his mask of indifference slipped, revealing the man beneath, angry, frustrated, confronted with the inevitable consequences of his actions. Judge Harrison allowed the jury verdicts to settle before he spoke. The jury has found the defendant guilty on all counts. The defendant is remanded into custody pending sentencing, which will occur in 30 days. During that time, a pre-sentence investigation report will be prepared. The judge paused, looking directly at Carlson. Mr. Carlson, you've been convicted of serious crimes that have caused significant harm to your community. Your sentencing will reflect the gravity of those crimes. Sarah Chen stood and approached the bench, and to everyone's surprise, so did Marcus Webb. Your Honor, Chen said, I want to note for the record the exceptional cooperation and bravery demonstrated by the key witness in this case. This child, Chen gestured toward Emma, overcame profound trauma to testify truthfully and clearly. Without her courage and her observations, this prosecution would have been substantially weakened. I believe her testimony should be considered when evaluating the success of this trial. Webb nodded, adding, the court also handled an unprecedented situation with remarkable wisdom and compassion. Allowing the presence of a facility dog wasn't traditional, but it resulted in a just outcome where a vulnerable witness was protected while truth was still extracted. That's not always easy to balance, Your Honor. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to Emma in the gallery. The little girl sat quietly in her grandmother's lap, not fully understanding what had transpired, but sensing that something significant had occurred. "The record will reflect," the judge said formally, "that this case serves as a powerful example of how the criminal justice system can adapt to protect its most vulnerable participants while still pursuing truth and justice. The courage demonstrated by the witness, the wisdom demonstrated by the legal professionals involved, and the effectiveness of unconventional approaches to trauma-informed witness support should be considered as potential models for future proceedings." The judge stood. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, something remarkable happened. Journalists who'd been skeptical about the unusual decision to allow a police dog in the courtroom began approaching members of the legal team, asking about the facility dog program, about trauma-informed witness procedures, about how Emma's testimony had changed the trajectory of the case. Sarah Chen found herself speaking passionately about the intersection of justice and compassion, about how the system could better serve vulnerable witnesses. Marcus Webb, surprisingly, agreed with every point she made. The two attorneys who'd been professional adversaries throughout the trial found themselves united in a vision for how criminal justice could evolve. Officer Morrison stood with Rex near the courtroom doors, and Emma, released from her grandmother's lap, approached the dog shyly. She placed her small hand on Rex's head, and the dog's tail wagged gently in response. "Good dog," Emma whispered again, the same two words that had broken through her terror days earlier. Patricia stood behind her granddaughter, tears streaming down her face. Her child had testified in federal court at age 3. Her child had confronted her deepest fears. Her child had found her voice. The verdict was guilty on all counts. But the real verdict, the one that mattered most, was that a traumatized child had discovered she was capable of extraordinary courage, that a system designed for judgment and punishment had found room for compassion, that justice could coexist with mercy, that truth could be extracted without exploitation, that sometimes the most powerful force in a courtroom wasn't legal argument but simple human and canine connection. Victor Carlson was led away by marshals, his empire crumbling, his freedom forfeit. But in the hallway of the federal courthouse in Denver, something more significant than any single conviction was taking place. A 3-year-old girl was learning that her voice mattered, that her truth had power, that she could survive in spaces designed to terrify her. And she'd learned it all because a police dog named Rex had decided to sit perfectly still and bear witness to her courage. 3 weeks after the verdict, Officer James Morrison sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. Rex lay at his feet, the dog's head resting on Morrison's shoe in that comfortable way that suggested complete contentment. On the table before them was an envelope, unremarkable in appearance, bearing only a handwritten address and a series of stamps that suggested it had traveled through the postal system with care. Inside was a drawing. Emma had created it with the unself-conscious artistry of a 3-year-old, crayon strokes bold and imaginative, colors applied with more enthusiasm than precision. But the subject matter was unmistakable. A massive golden dog with an impossibly joyful smile, standing protectively beside a tiny figure with wild hair and a heart floating above her head. Around them, Emma had drawn flowers, sunshine, and what appeared to be birds, symbols of safety and joy rendered in a child's visual language. Beside the drawing was a handwritten note from Patricia. "Dear Officer Morrison and good dog Rex, Emma wanted me to write this letter because she has so much she wants you to know. First, she says you are her heroes. She draws pictures of Rex almost every day. She keeps the one she made you on her nightstand, and she talks about you both constantly. But more importantly, Emma has healed in ways I never expected possible. After the trial, she had nightmares for about a week, terrible dreams where she'd wake up screaming. But then something shifted. She began talking about good dog Rex and how Rex wasn't scared, so she didn't have to be scared either. Gradually, the nightmare stopped. She sleeps through the night now. She doesn't wake up gasping in terror anymore. The trauma she experienced hasn't disappeared completely. She's still a child who witnessed things no child should witness. But she's learned that she can survive difficult things. She's learned that courage exists, that safety can be found even in scary places, that sometimes the most powerful thing one being can offer another is simply to exist, calmly and steadily, in the midst of fear. You changed my granddaughter's life. You and Rex gave her the greatest gift imaginable, the belief in her own strength. With eternal gratitude. Patricia. Morrison read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision on the final reading. Rex's tail wagged softly, as if the dog somehow understood the significance of the moment. In his 23 years of law enforcement, Morrison had received commendations, awards, and professional recognition. But this, a 3-year-old's drawing and a grandmother's heartfelt words, felt more meaningful than any official accolade. He carefully placed the drawing and letter in a frame on his desk. It would remain there for years to come, a physical reminder of what had transpired in that Denver courtroom. What Morrison didn't know, what wouldn't reach him for several weeks, was that Emma's case had sparked something far larger than one child's healing. The story had made local news initially, but it had quickly evolved into something more. National media outlets began covering the case, focusing specifically on the innovative use of a facility dog to support a traumatized witness. Psychology journals started publishing articles about the effectiveness of animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings. Victim advocates cited Emma's case as evidence that the justice system could be reformed to better protect vulnerable witnesses. By the time summer arrived, 14 Colorado courthouses had implemented facility dog programs. By autumn, the number had grown to 37. Within a year, courthouses across the United States were exploring similar initiatives. Sarah Chen found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for systemic change. She'd been invited to speak at prosecutor conferences, to testify before state legislatures about the benefits of trauma-informed witness support, to collaborate on developing best practices for integrating facility animals into legal proceedings. Her role had evolved from criminal prosecutor to institutional reformer. During one speaking engagement at the National Association of District Attorneys Conference, Chen stood before hundreds of her professional peers and told Emma's story. She described the 3-year-old girl frozen in terror, the breakthrough moment when a dog's presence had unlocked a child's courage, the profound realization that justice could be pursued while simultaneously protecting the vulnerable. "We've spent decades perfecting the machinery of criminal law," Chen told the assembled prosecutors. "We've become incredibly skilled at prosecution, at building cases, at securing convictions. But we've often done so at the expense of the people the system is ostensibly designed to protect. Emma's case taught me that we can do better. We can pursue justice without exploiting the vulnerable. We can extract truth without traumatizing witnesses. It requires creativity, compassion, and a willingness to challenge tradition, but it's possible." Marcus Webb, surprisingly, began collaborating with Chen on these reform initiatives. He became an advocate for defense attorneys to consider not just their clients' rights, but also the well-being of witnesses, particularly vulnerable ones. He wrote articles, gave speeches, and worked with victim advocates to develop protocols that protected witness dignity while maintaining the adversarial system's essential components. "The criminal justice system isn't broken," Webb explained in one interview, "but it has blind spots. It was designed by people who didn't fully consider how to protect the most vulnerable participants." Emma's case showed us that defense and prosecution don't have to be fundamentally at odds when it comes to protecting witnesses. We can maintain rigorous legal advocacy while still recognizing basic human dignity. Judge Harrison published a law review article titled "Compassion and Justice: The Integration of Animal-Assisted Therapy in Criminal Proceedings." In the article, He reflected on his initial skepticism about allowing a police dog in the courtroom, his gradual recognition that unconventional approaches might serve justice better than rigid adherence to tradition, and his conviction that future judges should consider similarly innovative approaches when circumstances demanded them. "The law is not merely a system of rules," Harrison wrote. "It is a human institution created by humans designed to serve human purposes. When that institution encounters situations where its traditional mechanisms fail to serve justice, as it did in the case of a terrified 3-year-old girl, then the institution must evolve. This is not weakness. This is wisdom." Officer Morrison was invited to speak at various law enforcement conferences about Rex's role in the case. He brought the dog with him, and Rex, who'd been trained to work in courtrooms and trauma situations, demonstrated his calm demeanor and his intuitive ability to comfort distressed people. Morrison emphasized that trauma-informed policing wasn't just about understanding victims' psychological needs. It was about recognizing that sometimes the tools officers brought to situations could be used in unexpected ways to serve justice more effectively. The facility dog program expanded exponentially. By the 5th anniversary of Emma's testimony, over 200 courthouses across the United States had implemented similar programs. Thousands of child witnesses and adult witnesses had benefited from the calming presence of trained animals during their testimony. Research studies documented the measurable psychological benefits: reduced anxiety, improved testimony coherence, lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among witnesses. Emma herself grew up with a unique relationship to her own history. She didn't carry traumatic memories of the courtroom experience the way many child witnesses did. Instead, she carried memories of courage, of finding her voice, of discovering that she was capable of extraordinary things even when terrified. By age 10, Emma had become an unlikely advocate for facility dog programs. She spoke at victim advocacy conferences, always beginning her remarks with the same phrase: "When I was 3 years old, a very good dog helped me be brave." Patricia watched her granddaughter transform from a terrified toddler into a confident young woman who understood, at a deep level, that trauma could be survived, that voices silenced by fear could be recovered, that sometimes the most powerful form of strength came not from individual effort, but from connection with another being who offered unconditional presence. 10 years after the trial, Officer Morrison received an invitation to a special ceremony at the Denver Federal Courthouse. A facility dog program was being formally named and dedicated. Emma, now 13 years old, was invited to participate in the ceremony. So was Rex, now 14 and nearing the end of his working career. At the ceremony, Emma stood before a gathered crowd: prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, victim advocates, law enforcement officers, and journalists, and spoke about her experience with remarkable clarity and eloquence. "I don't remember being scared," Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd processed her trauma into wisdom. "Or rather, I remember the fear, but I also remember something stronger. I remember Rex. I remember that good dog being there. I remember that I wasn't alone in that scary place, and I remember discovering that I could be brave." She paused, looking directly at Officer Morrison and Rex, both of whom sat in the front row. "The thing about trauma," Emma continued, "is that it makes you feel alone. It makes you feel like you're the only one experiencing something impossible. But trauma-informed care, whether it's from counselors, advocates, judges, or facility dogs, teaches you that you're not alone. It teaches you that other beings, other people, can sit with you in your fear without making it worse. That's what Rex did for me. That's what this program does for other witnesses. It says, you're not alone, you're brave, you can survive this." The crowd erupted in applause. Even hardened prosecutors and cynical defense attorneys found themselves wiping away tears. The facility dog program was officially named the Emma Initiative, a testament to a 3-year-old's courage and the ripple effects that emerged from one child finding her voice in the most unlikely of places. Years later, when Emma was an adult, she would become a victim advocate herself, working to reform the justice system in ways that honored both truth and compassion. But it all started with two innocent words spoken by a terrified child to a calm dog. Good dog. Those words had changed more than Emma's life. They changed the trajectory of criminal justice in America, proving that justice and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that traditional systems could evolve, that sometimes the most powerful force in a courtroom wasn't legal argument but the simple, profound presence of unconditional acceptance. Victor Carlson served 23 years in federal prison. He died there, his empire dissolved, his influence erased. But the legacy he created through his crimes, the ripples that transformed the justice system, continued far beyond his lifetime. And it all began with one small girl, one police dog, and the extraordinary courage it takes to speak the truth when terrified.